Another quick update and just some comments on the Quantum Free trainer. Specifically, as you guys can see in this title of this video, I want to talk about the space, and also if you were just using the Quantum Free trainer as your sole unit, maybe with some adjustable dumbbells and a somewhat minimal setup like this, because that's one of the big questions I get for this. I know a lot of people, I'd say the vast majority of people I've been talking to are actually considering this in their house and basement and possibly as a standalone unit. I think that's a good possibility. So I'll just break down some of the practical training comparisons between this and a squat rack. I'll talk about some of the cost and value perspectives to consider between one versus another. Some garage space logistics, if you're talking about the length and cable arm and all those dimensions. And then finally, just some accessories and expandability alongside just training style and I think who the target audience might be. As you can see, I did move some stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on here on the channel, but I want to move the Quantum Free trainer in the garage to actually show you where it is in place of the GetRx Tornado arms. Awesome, great setup and system. I just got more stuff coming in here, but I want to show you guys within the footprint, especially as that is gone, it is more noticeable to me just how small it is when you compare it to something of that size of the all-in-one functional trainers that are out there. Now that is probably harder for you guys to see on camera, so I did put on a little bit of comparison and dimensions here on the screen, say comparing it to a Rogue functional trainer. I just kind of found those numbers. Actually, Glenn had these numbers and sent to me a while back. Forgot to share them with you. All right, I do want to get a little more specific in the dimensions and space concerns, even though it is pretty explicit in the website what the dimensions are. And like I said, by just eyeballing it, it does seem smaller, but things change a little bit, understandably, and that's probably where the concern comes from when you got this top lever arm up here and how much height you may possibly need. And not only that, but also the length of the machine is going to extend out when you put this straight bar in there. So you do have to kind of consider all those things in the overall footprint. The base itself, as of right here, is not bad, but just addressing the height concerns. So right now with this top lat pull down, it's set at 83 inches, and that's what it says on the website. But as you go ahead and pull on this arc, that is probably the concern. To Glenn's defense, he usually, I think, does tell people it is still 83 inches, because as you can see, if you pull down right about here, which you're not going to pull any more higher than that, you're roughly still at 83 inches. Now you also have to account for the diameter of the way plate, and I think that is the big concern. So honestly, you got to add probably another, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches, I'd say, to that dimension. In fact, let's just go do that as I'm talking to you. So not the most sophisticated thing in the world, but I just want to show you, this would be probably normal pull. That's about 88 inches to be safe, so maybe 87, 86 might be something what you're looking at as far as pulling that down. Now I know that's not the most exact thing on the dime, but I don't know what your ceiling height's going to be. What Glenn will tell you that you can do, which not many people think about, and it's kind of a, again, give or take, is that you can actually flip this the other direction. You'd obviously have to sit a little bit lower, but you will not have to pull as high. The difference is, of course, that force curve, strength curve, whatever, is going to feel a little bit different because of the pull you got there. The width is advertised as 47 inches, and I would say it's pretty much an adequate working width, unless you start taking this thing off and going off to the side. Of course, you've got to accommodate for that. Glenn will then say this is actually better than a functional trainer, traditional squat rack, because the barbell dimension and length, and width will make it 84 inches, so a little bit longer than that. The big compensation here, which is really going to stretch out the machine, is that the length is at, I believe, 72 inches. Let me double check that. Yes, it is. But when you go ahead and add this extended bar in, it's going to put it out to 92 inches, which does extend things out a little bit, especially if you start accommodating a bench coming out this way. And if you guys also saw, I made an Instagram, or I think I made a short about this on here as well. I did have this thing in the very small second room of my basement where I put a lot of other small spaces in there, and this thing did fit. The only minor caveat is I think for some people it might be a little tight, and it is, you know, for what it is, it's not a giant machine, but in that space, it maybe seems a little outrageous. The only downside was you had to be really careful about having this thing hit the top of the ceiling, and that was something I definitely did. But I do think, in a nutshell, how I would kind of summarize this is if you're considering this or say a squat rack, I've said many times on the channel, I think a squat rack minimalist setup is great if you know how to use it and you're actually going to use those movements and maybe some things attached to that rack. I do think for a lot of people I talk to, though, they either have no interest in doing a lot of those barbell lifts or it's very minimal in what they use. So I personally love doing things like barbell squatting. But aside from that, if you're talking things like chest presses, rows, even shoulders, I would say a lever-based machine, Quantum Trainer, Power Tech, even lever arms. I know not everybody loves lever arms, but I do love lever or jammer arms. I actually prefer that for all that stuff. And then for legs, like I said, a barbell squat, I said definitely does work. I don't want to call Glenn out for sure, but I do think he has a lot of other interesting leg stuff coming with the cable. I think is going to surprise you guys. I'll just say that. And there's nothing they can throw by him that you actually could go ahead and set up some sort of a rack configuration, at least a way to rack a barbell. Ultimately, I think a squat rack is gonna make a lot more sense over this, or at least you're gonna need something to that effect if you're doing things that are more specifically barbell squats and possibly barbell benching. Everything else that you're doing with the barbell, you do not need a squat rack for that. And I also totally get the idea of fear of missing out with other things that can attach to this. I already alluded to the fact that Glenn has some very interesting stuff on the horizon. Very cool single joint stuff specifically for legs. And I know he's also alluded to the idea of all those limitations I just said about being able to, say, rack and unrack a bar, say for benching or squatting, are also not outside the realm of possibilities here as well. As far as attaching all the latest toys, like I threw on the Vultra on here, there's other ways you can certainly rig it if you guys want to. I'm just saying for basic stuff, doing seated rows, you could do lateral raises, cable rotations up here. Anchor actually works out there too as well. Awesome, great, just bicep and just auxiliary thing for shoulders. So I still love the way that thing feels. With the 3x3 uprights and this, you still have some possibilities. I'm not trying to oversell this, I don't want to do that. Don't think this thing is for everybody, no question. I'm just saying if you had this and say adjustable dumbbells, even just this alone, the big question you got to ask yourself is how often do you think you're going to use these? Possibly in conjunction with, say, a squat rack. And the other giant question that this is really for everybody and every piece of equipment is if you think you might get bored of this. Aside from those staples, I've said this many, many times, this is probably the 6th time I've said on this channel, I love this thing for what it does for the staples. I don't utilize a lot of the other landmine-based things. I'm not a big landmine person, although it goes without saying this thing is essentially a giant landmine machine if you want to take it that way. But aside from that, things such as the Viking pads and just using their bar for squats, I also think is a good alternative for people that maybe cannot do back squatting or just traditional barbell squats. So to answer that question I've been getting very often and recently directly, would you recommend this or a squat rack in my personal opinion? I think both would be the best situation if you had the space, but that is not the question at hand. The question is, would you recommend this or a squat rack? I hate to say it depends, but it does depend on some of these factors. Primarily, I would say the biggest one, the biggest barometer of all this stuff is, I'll get the cable functional trainer in a second, but if you're just talking about a squat rack versus this, for most people that I meet, again, I'm not saying across the board, I think for a lot of people, they should either learn to do some of these exercises a little bit better. Otherwise, if you do not like doing things, you don't do a whole lot of back squatting, and I also say probably bench pressing, this would be a better option. The other thing to kind of gauge it from, we know it's pretty popular with a lot of people, is that the all-in-one type of machines, I'll say old school all-in-one trainer, things like this, the station-based machines, Bowflexes, even things like the Total Gym or the like, if you have that personality where you can use, and also Power Tech Lever Gym, if you have the personality where you like and have no problem playing around and just switching up exercises, doesn't take that long, but it's also not the fastest thing in the world. If you like having one set machine with doing exercises that are very forgiving, things you're kind of used to, things that do not have a big learning curve, also things you can actually train to failure, then I do think you will like this. And honestly, the odds are if you're already asking that question, I would probably steer you more towards this, other than based on my experience, people's patience and how they kind of eventually develop and actually stick with some of the traditional barbell exercises. I love those things, don't get me wrong, so I couldn't really ditch those things, especially the barbell back squat specifically. But for a lot of people I talk to, if that is not you, not of an interest of you, then I would steer you the other direction. And also, like I kept saying, I'll repeat myself, I do see in the near future that Glenn is going to allow something or rig something that you actually could still do barbell squats and also barbell benching. And then on a related note to functional trainers and those all-in-one functional trainers, the question is how well does this thing work as a cable type of setup, meaning for lat pull downs, low rows, cable curls, whatever. So of course, as I already said, you can attach stuff if you guys really want to. That might not be the ideal situation for some people, but it is just easier for me to use that Vultra post up there. Rows actually work out really well there. But as far as just press down movements, I do like it a lot, but you might not like this arc. I actually like this as far as how it feels. The only downside is it's not going to be as fast to change things up, not just the weight itself to find that tension that works for you, but also this length in the chain. So that might be something you don't like. And then as far as, I might as well show you, on the fly, if I'm gonna do something like set up the low row, This is something I do hope Glenn does improve, or I'm sure he will come up with it, is some sort of a foot pad. Taking me about 20 to 30 seconds to get that lined up, but you know, is it as ideal if it has a nice flat post? I think he's got to make some sort of a flat post here because this works, but this has a little movement I don't really like. But you can do certainly seated rows. You could find that cable tension that you like for curls, and that also feels decent, but obviously not the same kind of tension and even displacement you would have with a traditional cable setup. I kind of hate to say it because it would add on the cost, but if you really wanted to and you're dabbling in these kind of portable cable things, which as I think time goes on, they might get more and more less expensive, you're decent space back there, especially if you were seated to do things like flies. You could rig resistance bands to some pins and also do that too if you wanted some cable action from that position. So of course it is possible. It's just, that's a little sacrifice for sure, is the cable option. That's it though, guys. Always open to hear you guys' thoughts about the Quantum Free Trainer. Very straightforward, who I think it's for, not for. So ask that question down below. Happy to give you guys a straight answer. If you still want to save money on the Quantum Free Trainer, I think they're sold up. I know they're coming in, I think November or October or something like that. Codes down below on the screen if you guys help support me in the channel. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.